Welcome to the Essential 99 Punctuation Rules for Court Reporters, video number 8, the comma, part 1. I'm Ken Wick. Let's get started. So this video is on the comma, and it's going to cover ebook rules 3 to 5, which are independent clauses with coordinating conjunctions, introductory subordinate clause or verbal phrase, and the initial elliptical clause. So rule number 3. Use a comma to separate two independent clauses joined with a coordinating conjunction. If the clauses are short, 4 or less words, the comma may be omitted. So, just a clarification or a little bit of a difference in the different references for what is defined as short. So they're all the references say if you have two independent clauses separate or joined with a coordinating conjunction that you separate them with a comma. But both of them do say if the clauses are short you can omit the comma, but there's a little bit of differences between the references. So LMEG says you can omit the comma if it's 5 or less words. The BGGP has 4 or less words. So if you're going to stick with the LMEG, you can just substitute 4 here. I chose 4 or less. So in some examples of this rule number 3 are these two blue, or what's highlighted blue, are independent clauses. So I went to the grocery store, and as a coordinating conjunction, I saw a friend from high school. So you see two independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction, then you separate them with a comma right here. Another example is, once again, the blue highlighted text are independent clauses, and you have a coordinating conjunction, so therefore you put a comma in between them. So my notes start on page 21. It's the first independent clause, comma, but my analysis begins on page 53. And then an example of two short independent clauses. So I was feeling ill and my friend left. So in this case, they actually qualify under both references. And then the rule I'm saying is 4 or less words. So since the two independent clauses join the coordinating conjunction, normally, or actually you could put a comma because they say it may be omitted. So you can put the comma here and still be totally right, but you may omit the comma in this case. Rule number 4. Use a comma to separate an introductory subordinate clause or an introductory verbal phrase from an independent clause. So basically, you have a subordinate clause or a verbal phrase which precedes an independent clause. You put a comma there. So some examples of a introductory subordinate clause is before my vacation to Hawaii. So this is the subordinate clause, and then it precedes the clause I broke my thumb. The next one is if you finish early. So this is a clause starting with a subordinate conjunction. If you finish early, and then you have the independent clause. I try to color code them based upon here so you can follow it. So if you finish early, you may start working on the next case file. So once again, the subordinate clause precedes the independent clause. Sometimes this independent clause is called the main clause. You put a comma to separate them. An introductory verbal phrase. So once again, they're color coded. So this determined to pass. This is a verbal phrase because this is starting with the first word is a verb that ends in ing, ed, or is a infinitive form. So determined to pass the skills test. This precedes the independent clause. The student planned many hours of practice. So you see this, you put a comma between the two, you separate them with a comma. Then here we have a verbal phrase. The first word starts with a verb or ends, the word ends in ing. So shopping for clothes during lunch. This is a verbal phrase. I ran into my previous boss. Rule number 5. Use a comma to separate an initial elliptical clause that stands for an independent or subordinate clause and a following dependent clause. So basically, this rule is now this elliptical clause. I notice I had two. I said if it stands for the independent clause or the subordinate clause. Interesting to note that the BGGP only has this for the elliptical independent clause, and the GRM, the Gregg's Reference Manual, only has it for the elliptical subordinate clause. And none of this is in the LMEG. So if you want to stick to your specific reference, then I've provided you with the clarification of, of how to apply these rules. So once again, rule number 5 is use a comma to separate an initial elliptical clause that stands for an independent clause or a subordinate clause. So some examples. Oh, I forgot to say this rule is necessary to speech, because when I've covered previously the elliptical clauses, people have a tendency to shorten things, and so they will speak in fragments. And we understand them because of the context. So what's happening is normally when you would write grammatically correct sentences, but in speech we don't speak grammatically. We'll shorten things and won't speak 100% grammatically. So how do we punctuate that when it comes to transcripts? And if you don't know, this is why this book is called Bad Grammar, Good Punctuation, because due to this fact, people don't speak grammatically, so how do you apply the rules of English or of punctuation to spoken language? So once again, this rule is necessary due to the spoken language. So an independent clause example. You saw now and then, but I hadn't fully recovered from my surgery. Now this now and then, we sort of doesn't make sense, but it would make sense in context. This is just two words joined with a conjunction. There's no verb. Is it even a subject? You can say, well, this is definitely a phrase because technically a phrase lacks a subject, a verb, or both. Well, maybe you can say this just lacks both, so this is just a phrase. So how would you punctuate this? Well, no doubt this now and then is an elliptical form of a independent clause or a subordinate clause. It could stand for, this now and then could stand for, I go out now and then, but I hadn't fully recovered from my surgery. The question might have been, do you get out? And they could have said, well, now and then, but I hadn't fully recovered from my surgery. And you would understand what they're talking about going out. The person just didn't say it. So you would punctuate it. And I back up all the way to fragments. Fragments, we punctuate. Rule number 1, where we had sentences that were fragments, we punctuated fragments just like they were complete sentences. This is what we're doing here. We're punctuating the fragment, the elliptical clause, just like if it were a full clause. Then another example is the receptionist, and I called the phone number. Well, once again, you have just this phrase. You're not too sure what it means, but it probably meant something in context. So we're going to separate it from the following independent clause with a comma. And this could have stood for, maybe someone asks a question is, oh, where'd you get the phone number? And the person could, and they responded, oh, the receptionist. I called the phone number. Well, that really meant I got the phone number from the receptionist and I called the phone number. So once again, I'm just saying this receptionist is just an elliptical form of a independent clause. So subordinate clause. Examples are, because these will now start with they should start. The subordinate clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. It's the only way to tell. So maybe you have, if so, I will bring the document tomorrow. Well, this if so is just a phrase. No subject, no verb. But it probably stood for something much longer. Like, if that is so, I will bring the document tomorrow. Now you have a subordinate clause. And we'll separate it with a comma. Next example is, should you be late, call me. So here we have a subordinate clause, and then which precedes, or elliptical subordinate clause followed by an independent clause. Probably stood for something longer, like if you should be late. So here, actually the subordinating conjunction has been removed. Should you be late, or if you should be late, you should call me. So this is a command form. Maybe the most important thing to recognize is that you actually have in all these cases that I'm pointing at, you have a independent clause. In these cases, you have a conjunction. In these cases, you don't. And whatever is in front of it is something that appears to be elliptical. It's not a complete sentence. Obviously when you're doing this, you don't have the punctuation. You don't have the answer in front of you. But you should be able to recognize, and this is one of the reasons why identifying independent clauses is important, is because you should be able to recognize that this is an independent clause, and the stuff that came in front of it is, you're like, well, I'm not too sure what that is. It's not what is that? But you probably go, well, this was something that was elliptical or a fragment of something, and you say, well, I need to separate that from the actual independent clause. In fact, I think the BGGP says if you have a coordinating conjunction and an independent clause following it, just put a comma here. Don't even, whatever precedes it, don't matter. It doesn't matter what it is. Well, we're assuming it's not another independent clause, but basically they're talking about anything that was elliptical. And this is true for the subordinating clause too. So that's it for this video. Please subscribe. And if you like the video, please hit like. And please buy the ebook. Thank you.